They say Traore is killing Fulani people. That's the story being whispered in backroom briefings in Paris, shouted in protests outside African embassies, and copy-pasted across Western headlines. Here are some examples from well-known sources. But are they following the same script? Is there anyone doing the propaganda? If yes, what is the truth they are hiding? Let's find out. In today's world, a bullet doesn't have to be fired to wound a nation. All it takes is a headline, clean, clever, and cruel enough to frame a war that never happened. That's what's unfolding in the case of Burkina Faso. The world is being told, not asked, not shown, but told, that Ibrahim Traoré's military is waging a coordinated ethnic cleansing campaign against Fulani people. Not just fighting insurgents, no, killing Fulani people, they say. Entire communities, no mercy, no distinction, and if you see this news, you would be compelled to hate Traoré. Now pause for a second and ask yourself this. Where is this information coming from? Because if it were happening on the ground, on the scorched plains of Djibo, or the crowded markets of Ouahigouya, the first to sound the alarm wouldn't be journalists in Paris or analysts in Brussels. It would be the Burkinabe people themselves. Yet the core voices pushing this Fulani massacre narrative are rarely from Burkina Faso. They're from foreign media outlets, NGOs, anonymous investigators, and exile accounts, many of whom haven't set foot in the Sahel in years. The anatomy of these headlines follows a familiar formula. Start with a clickbait accusation. Burkina Faso, unlawful killings, disappearances by the army. Source it to an unnamed NGO or human rights monitor. No footage, no coordinates, no names of victims. Add in emotional testimony from anonymous voices, often pulled from social media or unverified diaspora accounts. Wrap it all up with a political punchline. A call for international investigation, UN sanctions, or Western intervention. And just like that, the story is ready to be believed. But believing is one thing. Understanding is another. Let's take one infamous example. A widely circulated article published by VOA. The headline: Report accuses Burkina Faso's military of killings torture. But the content beneath that headline didn't contain a single confirmed photograph, no video, and no satellite verification. The evidence? Reports, which were neither named nor independently confirmed. The massacre it described. Turns out, it was a zone where militants had attacked a military convoy just hours before. Nowhere in the article was that military context mentioned. Just death, ethnicity, and outrage. The same pattern repeats across dozens of similar reports. They take real military operations, often in areas where insurgent groups operate openly, and strip them of context. They reduce every insurgent death to an act of ethnic targeting, even if it happened during a raid on confirmed insurgent camps. And they ignore the fact that many Fulani themselves serve in the Burkinabe armed forces, local defense groups, or are victims of insurgency too. The effect is devastating, not to Traoré's army, but to the truth. What these stories do is feed the narrative that African governments cannot conduct counter-terror operations without becoming genocidal. That any military strike in Fulani areas is automatically an act of ethnic aggression. African leadership cannot be trusted to handle its crises. It's colonial logic with a new coat of paint. Africans must be supervised, restrained, watched. And if they step outside the lines, even in self-defense, they must be publicly shamed and globally punished. But the more you zoom in on these headlines, the more they fall apart. Now the question is, who is Traoré fighting against? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. To answer that, we have to step away from the noise and into the dust and sweat of Burkina Faso's real battlefield. Not the imaginary one carved out in European headlines, but the one that stretches across the northern provinces, deep into zones that were once written off as lost to terror. Because what's happening in Burkina Faso right now isn't genocide. It's a military revolution, not just in tactics, but in ideology. And it's being led by a captain who understands one brutal fact: insurgency doesn't care about ethnicity, and neither can the fight against it. Under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership, the Burkinabe military has undergone a transformation that most analysts still haven't caught up with. What they assume is a ragtag army lashing out blindly is, in reality, a deeply organized campaign with surgical objectives. Let's break that down. First, Traore introduced ZDP, high-risk zones where insurgent activity is known to be concentrated. These zones aren't defined by ethnicity, language, or tribal boundaries. They're defined by hard data: movement of arms, drone surveillance, intercepted communications, and civilian reports. Within these ZDPs, the military doesn't operate alone. It now works in tandem with VDPs, civilian defense units composed of locals from the same regions under attack. Ethnically mixed patrols where Fulani, Mossi, Gourmanche, and Bissa youth serve side by side, a direct counter to the idea that the army is ethnically biased. Localized command centers, where intelligence is drawn from village elders, hunters, and traders who know the terrain better than any drone ever could. This isn't chaos. This is a grassroots counterinsurgency. Take the 2024 operation in Kane, near the Malian border. It was one of the largest anti-terror offensives of the year. Intelligence had pinpointed a cell of ISGS fighters responsible for multiple roadside bombings and civilian kidnappings. The group was holed up in a stretch of woodland frequently used by Fulani herders. Now here's where the Western narrative would say, the army swept in and massacred civilians. But what happened? The military delayed the operation for 3 days, sending community negotiators ahead to warn villagers. Fulani elders from a nearby settlement were consulted in advance to identify which families had been threatened or displaced by the insurgents. When the strike came, it targeted a specific 6-kilometer corridor, confirmed by aerial recon as an arms depot and insurgent passage. The result? 22 insurgents were neutralized. 0 civilian deaths. No headline. No praise. Just silence. Because stories like that don't feed the myth. Meanwhile, across the country, other efforts have been just as deliberate. In Soum province, for instance, VDPs, composed entirely of Fulani men, trained and armed by the government, now guard their communities against Islamist militants. They wear the Burkina Faso flag on their shoulders, and they say it proudly. We are not insurgents. We are protectors. But of course, this doesn't fit the Western media's preferred script. To them, a Fulani man with a gun is either a victim or an insurgent. He cannot possibly be a soldier. He cannot possibly support his state. And yet, that is the new reality Traore has created. One where identity does not determine loyalty. Let's be even clearer. If this were an ethnic war, the Burkina Faso army wouldn't be recruiting Fulani volunteers. It wouldn't be paying compensation to Fulani civilians accidentally caught in crossfire, as it did in Barcelogo earlier this year. And it wouldn't be launching reconciliation projects in conflict-torn areas like Yaga and Seno, specifically aimed at rebuilding trust between Fulani herders and Mossi farmers. Instead, what we're seeing is precision warfare in one of the most complex terrains on Earth. A place where militants don't wear uniforms, where terror cells move on motorcycles, and where the enemy is defined by behavior, not bloodline. Traore's strategy has even adopted a new term, neutralisation sociale, not just killing insurgents, but cutting off their roots in society. That means shutting down fake madrasas, disrupting their propaganda machines, exposing their funding networks, and isolating the ideologues, many of whom operate under the mask of religious leaders in Fulani majority zones. Again, this isn't ethnic targeting. This is ideological surgery. And guess what? It's working. Between 2023 and early 2025, insurgent attacks dropped. Over 600 villages were recovered and resettled, including Fulani communities that had fled insurgent blackmail. Even the UN Office for West Africa quietly admitted in a leaked internal report that Burkina Faso had made more ground against insurgents than any other Sahelian state. But rather than celebrate, the headlines scream louder. Fulani targeted. Traore accused. Massacre reported. Because in this war, winning is dangerous. It disrupts the script. It threatens the industries, both literal and narrative, that profit from a weak Africa. Traore's military campaign is not a genocide. It's a refusal to surrender. And the real threat isn't the rifle he carries. It's the unity he's building in a region that was designed to stay divided. So if the fight is this strategic, this disciplined, why do the protests look so chaotic? If Burkina Faso were truly killing Fulani people in an organized, systematic campaign, wouldn't the outrage begin in Dori? Wouldn't the screams rise from Kaya? Wouldn't Ouagadougou be burning with protests? Instead, the loudest cries of genocide are coming from boulevards in Paris, downtowns in Brussels, and squares in Montreal. Flags are waved, placards are raised, chants echo through neighborhoods that haven't seen Sahelian dust in decades. Cameras roll, hashtags trend, and headlines are manufactured in real time. But here's the thing, none of this is happening in Burkina Faso. People seem very happy in Burkina Faso. The people screaming into microphones thousands of kilometers away claim to speak for persecuted Fulani communities. But there's a reason they're not speaking from Fadangurma or Gorom Gorom. Because in Burkina Faso, the Fulani are not screaming genocide. They are fighting side by side with the state to protect their land from terror. So, who are these protesters? It's time we meet the new face of foreign interference. Not soldiers, not spies, but professional protesters in diaspora networks, many of whom haven't lived in West Africa in decades, if ever. Their slogans are ready-made, their posters printed with NGO funding, and their movements surprisingly coordinated. Let's break this down. First, there is a network of Fulani diaspora organizations across Europe and North America that have become the loudest voices in this propaganda war. Now ask yourself, why would organizations headquartered in Europe care more about Fulani lives than the Fulani leaders in Burkina Faso? The answer, they don't. They care about preserving narratives, justifying foreign concern, and delegitimizing nationalist African governments like that of Traore, who have kicked out French troops, UN missions, and refused to play the game of dependency. Even more suspicious is the timing of these protests. Every time Burkina Faso achieves a major victory against terror groups, suddenly, a new wave of Fulani protests emerges abroad. It's almost a media reflex. Burkina liberates 50 villages. A week later, ethnic cleansing protests in Geneva. VDPS foil an insurgent plot in Yaga. 2 days later, a Fulani rights march in Lyon. Traore meets with Mali and Niger to expand the Confederal Alliance. Boom, diaspora unrest in Belgium. This pattern isn't a coincidence. It's reactionary media warfare. Even the messaging reveals the script. Protesters carry signs reading, "Burkina Faso is a war criminal state." These are not statements rooted in grassroots pain. They're designed to mirror Western moral panic. They use loaded Western vocabulary to trigger outrage, not to tell the truth. Because the truth, that the real enemy is insurgency, doesn't trend as well. And let's not forget the invisible hand behind the slogans. French media outlets like RFI and France 24 give these protests more coverage than they give to actual victims of insurgent attacks in Burkina Faso. And when Fulani elders inside Burkina Faso speak up in defense of the government, silence. No coverage, no platform. So what's the goal of the ones carrying signs in Europe? They're not demanding justice. They're demanding a narrative. One that paints Africa as still too primitive to govern itself, still too tribal to distinguish between war and peace, still too unstable to be trusted with weapons or sovereignty. And what happens if this fake narrative wins? African unity breaks. The war against terror gets labeled genocide. Foreign troops return, not to help, but to monitor. And a leader like Traore, who has done what few dared to try, is painted as a villain. It's not about Fulani rights, it's about narrative control. And the battlefield now includes camera lenses, hashtags, and French visas. So, if this is a story built on foreign agendas and staged outrage, what's the truth they're hiding? The most dangerous trick of modern warfare isn't the bullet, it's the disguise. When the enemy stops wearing uniforms and starts blending into villages, cultures, and even sacred identities, they become harder to see, harder to name, and nearly impossible to fight without being called a criminal. This is the reality Burkina Faso faces today. Because the insurgents waging war on its soil aren't strangers marching under foreign flags, they're men who speak the local dialects, wear the right clothes, and in many cases, carry Fulani names. Let's make one thing clear before we go further. Being Fulani does not make you an insurgent. But in the Sahel, some of the most brutal insurgent networks have deliberately recruited, manipulated, and hidden among Fulani communities, knowing that any counterattack could be spun as ethnic violence by foreign observers. It's a tactic, a shield, a calculated form of camouflage, and it's been working for nearly a decade. Let's rewind to 2015. the year Burkina Faso truly began descending into insurgent chaos. By that time, neighboring Mali had already been overrun by insurgent groups. These groups needed two things: mobility across borders, a pool of recruits with reason to distrust the state. And that's when they turned to the Fulani population. The Fulani, also known as Pule, are a proud, nomadic ethnic group spread across West Africa. Historically pastoral, they've often been marginalized by both colonial and post-colonial regimes due to their mobility, lack of land rights, and economic independence. This made them fertile ground for radical propaganda. Insurgent recruiters exploited this. They showed up not as invaders, but as defenders of Fulani dignity. They pointed to land disputes between Fulani herders and Mosi farmers and framed them as religious or racial oppression. They offered weapons, protection, and identity. And slowly, the lines between culture and combat blurred. By 2017, Burkina Faso's intelligence reports already warned of strategic radicalization within Fulani zones. Their mission wasn't just to destroy state authority. It was to become indistinguishable from the people. Villages that once thrived as trade hubs became ghost towns overnight. Families who refused to cooperate were slaughtered. Children as young as 12 were taken to Quranic schools that were nothing more than training camps for missions. And most chillingly, local leaders who spoke out were labeled traitors to the Fulani cause and assassinated. By 2020, over 100 Fulani chiefs and community elders across the Sahel had been executed by Fulani insurgents. It was never about religion. It was about replacing identity with ideology. So, when Traore's forces moved in years later to root out these groups, they weren't targeting Fulani people. They were facing an enemy that had already buried itself inside Fulani spaces, hijacking their name, their clothing, their language. Let's be honest, this makes war harder. It also makes the propaganda machine easier to run. Because now, anytime an insurgent is killed in a Fulani majority area, the headlines don't say, "Insurgent neutralized." They say, "Fulani man shot by soldiers." The nuance is gone. The context was erased. And that is exactly what the insurgents want. They are not hiding in Fulani communities by accident. They are hiding because they know the West still sees Africa through tribal lenses, where every death is ethnic, and every counter-terror operation is painted as a massacre. The result? Traore's military cannot strike without being accused, even if the targets are found with weapons, bomb-making tools, and insurgent propaganda, even if they've killed dozens of civilians, even if local Fulani informants themselves point them out, because the enemy wears the mask of Fulani, and the world sees only the mask. This is not the Fulani people's fault. They are victims too of brainwashing, of infiltration, and of the silence from global media when insurgents target their villages for not cooperating. But until that truth is told, Traore will be accused of crimes he didn't commit. He isn't fighting Fulani culture. He's fighting a radical infection that uses Fulani identity as its shield. And that, above all, is what the global media refuses to understand. But someone else understands it. Someone is helping these insurgents stay protected, funded, and invisible. So, who is behind all this? Is it an external force? Can you guess? Let us know in the comment section. Who is trying to control the narrative? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.